Hello friends, this is a quick warmer on article number 3 for us, team 2. Hoping that this recording can make it easy for folks to begin their own reading on it. So this particular investigation looked at creatine supplements in a similar group of patients to articles 1 and 2, which is polymyositis, dermatomyositis, that appears to be inactive, but there is the persistence of a general weakness. This study uses exactly the same exercise regimen as for Article 1 and 2 with resistance and aerobic training. We're going to see that there are some differences in terms of the support, and we can query the authors on that, the support that was given to the participants of the research trial, and also in the expansion of the outcome measures that were generated. So again, we have our beautiful, rich, informative abstract, which will tell us the objectives and the methods, and in total, the results of the most important factors or surprising factors, and then an overall conclusion. So this study also differed from Articles 1 and 2 in the length of the study, and also in the fact that there were two centers, actually from two different countries. One center was in Sweden and the other center was in the UK. So that's very interesting. And then you will see that the primary outcome measure, which here they are naming in the forefront, is the aggregate functional performance time, and we'll look at that. That's composed of several components, which we'll look at briefly a little bit later. And then the secondary outcomes was again our familiar outcome measure here with the functional index, which captures endurance. And they implemented in this trial something called a P magnetic resonance spectroscopy, whereby that looks at the uptake and perhaps the use of creatine in the muscles. And again, they tell us up front that all patients had to be receiving stable doses of immunosuppressant therapies or corticosteroids. There are overall results, 37 patients with PM or DM, and they actively excluded IBM. We'll look at the inclusion-exclusion criteria in a moment. There were 29 patients that ended up completing, the results based on this number was that there was an improvement compared with placebo in their primary outcome measure, which was again the aggregate functional performance time. And they also perceived that there was improvement, as we expected from Article 1 and Article 2, in improvement in functional index in both the creatinine and placebo group. So remember here again, the only thing that's different between this and Article 1 and 2 is that there's the addition of this supplement, creatine. But everybody's getting exercise the same exact way. There was some reservation about the benefit between the groups. Okay, and then they talked about that spectroscopy, that magnetic resonance change, and that the ratio for that increased significantly in the creatine group, but it didn't increase significantly in the control group. And they report that there were no clinically relevant adverse events. But there was the question from one of our research partners as to whether falls are in fact an adverse event because it could be related to the exercise. So they surmised that oral supplementation with this home-based exercise program did improve the functional performance without any significant adverse events. So let's move on quickly. So this introduction, I think it's going to be easy for everyone to read because these are concepts that are already well understood by the group. One concept to think a little bit more about is this muscle bioenergetics assessment, where we're using this P, magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And why are they doing this? And what they're doing is they're looking at this nuclear medicine type scan, it seems like, to see the uptake and the difference of phosphocreatinine in the muscle itself. And what they're trying to do here is demonstrate that if there was an improvement, they wanted to see that there was a biophysical way to support the changes that we're seeing clinically with the use of the creatine supplements. And the idea behind this is that the use of creatine would possibly be replenishing lower levels of creatine that are hypothesized in patients with inflammatory muscle disease. And so by increasing the supply, we may be able to help muscles function better. The creatine actually helps to create ATP, which you remember from Article 2 is an important component in energy. And remember that just as a consequence that the type 1 fibers for endurance had much more ability to create ATP than the type 2 fibers, right? So not that that is so important for this, but I just wanted to harken back to a time where you would have considered ATP in the past. So the thought is that the supply of creatine in an oral compound form would be available to the muscles, and therefore people taking this compound on top of exercise, because the only way it would probably work is with exercise and in an exercise program, would increase muscles' energy stores, and therefore people would be able to exercise longer, and therefore the healing component of exercise would be able to be harnessed to a greater degree than if we were not using these supplements. And they talk about that there was a pilot study, and there's some minor reporting of the results of that study, but for our purposes, we have the information on randomized placebo-controlled trial, and that's what we're going to focus on. Although in the article, they are going to talk about the results that inspired the group to move forward with a randomized placebo-controlled trial. Because remember, randomized placebo-controlled trials are expensive, and they take an awful lot to organize and to recruit for. So they did a preliminary assessment of whether this was even at all feasible or worthwhile. So they talk a little bit about that. So how they designed the trial, it was a 6-month randomized placebo-controlled trial. They appeared to offer to patients who met inclusion-exclusion criteria initially. So as patients came to their visits, so we call this a convenience sample or consecutive sample. And that's as opposed to going through records and trying to find patients. And this increases the randomization aspect. But they did say that some patients were specifically referred to be part of the trial. So from an outlying facility, probably. So the inclusion criteria, and this is interesting for consideration, is that there were several, and they were adult patients, they were patients with PM and DM, and they had to have disease duration for more than 6 months, and they had to have neither clinical nor histologic evidence, meaning muscle biopsy evidence of inclusion body myositis. And we know that's important because that's a different disease that responds differently. And the participants had to have at least quadriceps muscle strength of 20% below the predicted values. And that is important because we need somewhere to go in terms of demonstrating improvement. And that we are really selecting for the population of patients that have controlled disease but residual muscle weakness. And so folks had to be able to participate in the study in terms of their mobility to engage in the exercise program, and they had to had previous therapy with steroids for at least 6 months, with a stable dose for 2 months. And patients with stable disease activity, that their physician believed was low. So, and then they had to be on stable immunosuppressive doses as well. But the exclusion criteria is important. Anyone that had taken place in a formal active exercise program within the last 6 months, and that means the reason for that is to make sure that we are getting folks that will respond to the treatment of the exercise itself, and they're not people who have been through an exercise program and it's as good as they're going to get. So we really wanted they really wanted to see people who would have potential to respond and didn't already have a trial, and they're as good as they can get. So, and also folks that were unable to exercise sufficiently to participate, as well as any serious medical disorders such as kidney or liver problems. And the reason for that is because of the compound, the medication itself can be hard on the kidneys, and if folks are taking it, they usually have to take a break. And because there's a kidney component to it, we automatically are concerned about effects on the liver. And also folks that were pregnant or of childbearing age, again, because of the component, the compound, the medication itself. And then again, because of the magnetic resonating component, that metal implants, people that had metal implants that couldn't do this MRS component were excluded. So the intervention was, again, this oral creatine substance or placebo. They got a loading dose of 20 grams each day for 8 days just to get it on board. And then they had 3 grams a day. They're just telling us where they got it from. And then the exercise program. We know what this exercise program was. But the difference here in the support is that instead of doing that kind of very meticulous outreach, what they're describing here is something different, whereby they gave patients a leaflet demonstrating the exercise program, and then the participants were asked to read it and then encouraged to ask any questions about the program after. And then they checked compliance of taking the creatinine substance or the placebo with each visit. So the outcome measures, again, the AFTP, which was the aggregate functional performance time, and this is a composite of 4. That's where they get the aggregate name from, a composite. It was a combination of 4 functional assessments. One is the 50-foot timed walk, where you timed 50 minutes. And then they get up and go, where you get up from a chair and you walk a distance and you come back and sit down and you're timed how long that takes you to do it. In this case, it usually is really a 10-foot walk either way, but here for some reason they're doing a longer walk, a 50-foot walk time, and a stair ascent and a stair descent, each of which were 19 steps, and each of these would have had to have been timed. And they look at the overall time so that it takes, and they report, and this is important because we're looking at good outcome measures for exercise trials in myositis, that this was based on a prior experience in clinical trials, because it tends to be simple and it's repeatable between patients, so you can rely on the information, and it's perceived to be relevant to daily living activities. And also reflects the ability to of engaging in high intensity physical activity, and that's beyond endurance. So the secondary outcome measures, the functional index in myositis, and in this case there was a maximum score of 64. And I'm not sure if they still use that scale, but yes, they did. I mean, no, they didn't. That was for the manual muscle test. The manual muscle test, which I think we commented on before, that it's really good to have a strength measure in addition to having an endurance measure in myositis. And that's something that we would explore in terms of outcome measure recommendations in our project. And a manual muscle test was scored on 0 to 5. Many of us use a 0 to 5, but some of us also use a 0 to 10. But for whatever reason, they chose the 0 to 5. And then again, the creatinine kinase, CK, also called CPK. And then to gain the health status, they looked at the Nottingham Health Profile, and the short form McGill Pain Questionnaire, and the Hospital Anxiety Depression Scales, also called the HADS, and if they had a fatigue scale. What was missing that was part of 1 and 2 was the short form 36, which was a health-related quality of life measure, as well as the disease impact profile, which was used on the other 2 studies. So they're describing that there was standardization between the two centers in the UK and in Sweden. So then now they're talking about how they came to their sample size, which is what they did is they used a power calculation. And what that is that it's looking at the number of people that are necessary to include in a study to make sure that the results that we're seeing are real. So if we're seeing that the intervention is working, we want to make sure, how confident are we that that is a real result? Or if it's saying that it's not working, how confident are we that this is in the results that it is not working? And the way to do that is before you start the study to do what is called a power calculation. And power, again, is referring to the number of um, patients. So, and the confidence interval that you want to see. So if we say a study is powered for a 90% confidence interval, that means you're having enough patients that you're going to be sure that what you're seeing only has a 5% margin of error. And so what they did there in this study was powered for a sample size of 56 patients. And they also put in a contingency of a dropout rate. So that's really important too, because that's thinking ahead in terms of trial design to avoid problems of dropping out. So the sample size of 56, and so that was with a little bit of cream on top. And recruitment, when they finally had 60 patients that were screened, then they said, okay, let's stop. Let's stop recruiting. But what ended up happening is when in the screening visits, the results were that 23 were excluded, and the rate of exclusion was higher than they had actually anticipated. So thankfully they did build in the 20% dropout rate, but it wasn't enough. But they didn't have the resources to continue screening. So they were just happy with the 23, and they did a post hoc, meaning afterwards they did a power analysis to see how true these results would be with the number of patients that they actually did enroll, which was the 56 patients. So their margin of error with this outcome measure was 13%, and they addressed that this conferred a 75% power as opposed to 95%. So they did the randomization. The centers did it separately, meaning that there was no central randomization center overall, but they did do it with a electronic method, from my recollection. The statistical methods, and here they talk about the pilot study. And so this was a 2-month study where they saw promising results in their primary outcome measure and in the spectroscopy study, the MRS. So the results of this study is that this study went on from 1999 to 2003. Again, the recruitment was stopped after 60 patients were screened. Though there was a high dropout rate, they felt they couldn't extend this study beyond 4 years because of resources. And ultimately, a total of 19 patients received creatine, and 18 patients received placebo. And the mean ages are described here. They talked about the aggregate functional performance index, and that with this additional statistic method, they identified that this linear regression analysis predicted that 94% of the variation, uh, 95% confidence in the variation of the between all these outcome measures, the primary outcome measure and these secondary outcome measures. And then they double checked to see if any of these findings in patients, for example, did the disease duration, or if somebody had a lot of pain, using the McGill score, I guess, or no, the NHP, the Nottingham Health Profile. So if they turned out to be patients that had more pain, patients that had more difficult coping skills, perhaps, as an example, if that at all could have impacted the study results. That was not the case. So 6 months later, they are looking at these results between them, and this is more of a description, statistical change. And here again, they're looking at the changes with the creatinine group in terms of the aggregate functional tool, and that there was a very strong correlation within the group before and after. And then they're looking at the changes because they did these studies again at 3 months. Again, that even then there was some statistical differences. Then they talked about the performance of these outcome measures, and how they did in and of themselves and in comparison to placebo, as well as including the strength and these other measures. Strength according to MMT8, and then these other outcome measures down here. So, and then the changes in the scan that was done is discussed here. Okay. The erythrocyte count, sedimentation rate, and CK levels, there didn't seem to be any changes within the groups or between the groups. And the adverse events that they noted, there were 22 in 13 patients that included infection, falls, and gastrointestinal problems. And they put it down to none of them as being related to creatine treatment. I'm just going to show you this one. So here is, this is the creatine group, the group that's taking the supplement. This is the group that is not taking the supplement. And remember, everybody's exercising. And these are the differences. Remember, this is for the MMT8, the MMT5. In this case, there's 5 regions being evaluated at baseline, then 3 months and 6 months in the creatinine group, and then the same in the control group. And then this is the significance between the two groups, that you can see the only ones that are not statistically significant are the ones that say NS, but everything else is statistically significant. But we already know that this is, although it's good to see the difference, I guess. how this fared in the control group. And so yes, they at this time, this was one of the largest controlled trials that had been done um, in myositis and exercise. They talk about the power as in terms of a limitation, but they confirm that exercise in and of itself is beneficial. They discuss the interpretation of what the scan studies could have meant. Um, and they talk a little bit about the creatinine supplements in terms of um, um, repairing muscle dysfunction, and where they have worked in the past and where they haven't worked in the past, um, and um, and why we think it perhaps is working in myositis. Um, they talk about the adverse events that they didn't perceive to be clinically relevant, and and they talk a little bit more about the limitations of their study. Um, and so they're, again, just encapsulating in conclusion that it appears that adding creatine to what we already know to be helpful and useful in patients in terms of developing strength and higher endurance, which is exercise, but adding creatine supplements can augment that response to exercise. And that's it. I hope this was helpful. I always feel that it's not, but I'm always ever so pleased to find out that my perception is wrong. And I always welcome feedback. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.